This video is just for you if you're a flight student or if you're a CFI training flight students for their private ride. Everybody's a little nervous talking to the DPE. Well, we got a fix for that. Pat Brown, a DPE from Houston, Texas, and my good friend is going to tell you how to ace your private pilot check ride. Passing your check ride on the first try saves money and it lowers stress. This episode is brought to you by Rexair Professional Pilot Academy of Sebring, Florida. They've got everything a flight student needs to be successful. So give them a call, 309-397-6191, or drop them a line, info@rexair.net. Mr. Brown, because flight training has gotten bigger and bigger recently, and it's hard to get an appointment with a DPE for a lot of people, and everybody stresses about it. I was reviewing this mentally today, and I believe I've taken about 10 check rides for certificate or rating. I was always nervous. I always passed. I'm pleased about that. You've taken a few more than that because you've got a couple ratings I don't have, but you've done hundreds from the other seat as the DPE. So would you be willing to talk about how maybe people could ace their private pilot check ride by just being prepared and knowledgeable about the situation?
Yeah, it's closing into close to 2000 at this point, actually. So, yeah, I'd be, I'm tired, Jamie.
I'll bet you are. Well, let's dispel one rumor right off the bat.
Right.
The examiner is not some mean ogre who gets a charge out of sending out disapproval letters. You're not preloaded to say, oh, good, I get to send somebody home in tears.
Oh gosh, no. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I can tell you that all the ones that I know, and I know a bunch of them, we're all on the side of the applicant. We really are. We want them to pass. Part of that is selfish because if they don't pass, then we have to find a time in our busy schedule to come back and re-examine them. So, we really do want them to pass the first time. It's much, much more fun and much more fulfilling to be able to hand them a certificate and say, congratulations, shake their hand, take a picture with them or whatever. And then having to say, sorry, man, or sorry, young lady, not now.
And I'm sure you do your best to put them at ease, but every applicant is nervous, understandably so. One of the things I always found as an instructor, though, they can lower that anxiety significantly if they just prep by doing simple things like read the ACS, including the appendices, so they actually know what's going to be in the ride because there are no surprises. It's all written down.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this before in various videos on similar subjects, but and today we're talking about the private pilot check ride. But here's the ACS for the private pilot check ride, and it's free. I mean, I paid ASA for this because I wanted a nice bound copy, but it's free. But this is not the only reference that you need. You also need the companion guide because there's some really good information in the companion guide. And again, this is downloaded from the FAA website, so it's not fancy, but it's free. They're both free if you want to download them from the FAA website. But the companion guide has some really, really good stuff in there that used to appear in each one of the ACSs, which made the ACSs much thicker. And now they've just put one companion guide that applies to all of them. But that's something that's handy to have too. So yeah, let me give you kind of an example of two check rides, two extremes, just very quickly here. Last week, Wednesday, I met with a young man, very nice young man, very personable. We had a great, kind of get acquainted. Our guidance says spend some time with small talk and get acquainted. I'm paraphrasing, but basically it says, spend some time with some small talk and get acquainted and maybe establish some common interests or something like that. So I do that with every ride. And I would say the vast majority of us do exactly that. And I said, okay, well, all right, let's go ahead and get started. It's great to learn a little bit about you. And the first words out of his mouth were, well, I want to avoid a train wreck right up front. And I'm thinking about, okay, what's about to come? Well, he'd forgotten his logbook. He'd forgotten his medical. He didn't have a copy of the airworthiness certificate on the airplane. He had forgotten his knowledge test. He didn't have a 90-day current solo. This is a private pilot ride, a 90-day current solo endorsement. And he didn't have the POH. So we couldn't do any
I,
performance calculations.
I believe I've narrowed down the problem to a half dozen real big deals.
So fortunately, his wife was at home and they lived 15 minutes from the airport, and he knew where his logbook was, and in his logbook was his medical and some of the other things that he had forgotten. She was kind enough to bring those to us, so we were able to do some other stuff, as we were waiting. But it got things started off really on the wrong foot, and the oral. Because he wasn't really well prepared, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. The oral ran about 2 hours and 15 minutes, 2 hours and a half. Now, contrast that by today, another young man, same flight instructor, by the way, same airport, same flight school, walked in. Everything was in a binder. Everything was in order. We went through it zip, zip, zip. And uh, he he was so well prepared. We were done with the oral, and I was looking for other things to talk to him about in an hour and a half. And usually a private pilot oral will run somewhere around an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours if they have to look a bunch of stuff up. But, again, like a tale of two cities, right? Here's the one guy that comes in and doesn't have literally about 8 items that he should have. Another guy comes in much better prepared. It took us 20 minutes to qualify him and the airplane and get through IACRA, and we were into the oral by 9:25. This other guy, by the time we got everything straightened out, we started at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was 10:15 before we got started. And had
Man.
his wife not been home, this would have been all right. It would not even a discontinuance because we hadn't done any IACRA paperwork yet. And again, he would have lost some money because he's compensated me to come out and do this, and it's going to cost him again because in my policy is basically if the trek ride can't happen because of something you leave out, it it's going to cost you. And fortunately, that has really cut down on the amount of this kind of stuff happening. It rarely happens anymore. But Jamie, here's the thing, and we've talked about this before. We talk about the book here. Everything is written down, but even more importantly, if you look at the appendix, the Airman Certification Standards Companion Guide, Section 7 in this book lists everything that they need to bring to the check ride.
Yeah, there's literally a checklist. Just
There's literally a checklist, and
well, let me.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's three possible outcomes when we do a check ride, and
Correct.
and the ideal, of course, is I get my temporary certificate. It's good for 120 days. Now I can get my private certificate. I could get a letter of discontinue, or I'm sorry, a letter of disapproval, which nobody wants, but that's not the end of the game. It's good for 60 days. I
Yeah.
can go brush up with my instructor and come back. But there's a much misunderstood one, the letter of discontinuance, which you
Yeah.
just
Correct.
mentioned that it's not one. That I think is really misunderstood because that's something I might request. And my example for right now will be just the other day in Phoenix, where there's an awful lot of flight training. There was a huge dust storm. Now, if I'm in the office with you and I'm doing the oral, and of course it's me, so I'm killing it. I'm getting everything right. I've got all the references. And we come out to do the pre flight, and it's just unbelievable bad sand. We can't breathe.
Yeah.
Close the door so it doesn't blow into the building.
Yeah.
I might be best off to ask you for a letter of discontinuance and say, I'd like to come back and do this on a better day. What's your
Mhm.
stance on that as a DPE?
An applicant can ask for a discontinuance anytime he or she wishes. It could be um, they may sense that the oral is not going very well because if I bring the oral to an end because it's not going very well, it's going to be a disapproval.
Mhm.
But if the applicant really has a feeling that look, I'm tanking this thing, Ask for a discontinuance. I'm not going to argue with you. I don't think any examiner would argue with an applicant that says I want a discontinuance. I'm not feeling good. I didn't sleep well last night. My nerves are getting the better of me. I need a discontinuance so that I can regroup and come back and perform better. Perfectly okay. The you know the uh, I usually tell the applicant, if you get sick, I get sick. The airplane won't start. The weather, isn't good. Um, it's windy. The crosswinds beyond your personal minimums.
Mhm.
What the ceiling isn't quite high enough for you to be comfortable with. Any of those kind of things or I'm just not. I'm things aren't going well.
Mhm.
Perfectly okay to ask for a discontinuance. That's good for 60 days. And as with the disapproval, the applicant gets credit for everything that he or she did up until that point. Beyond 60 days, we have to do it all over again.
Good to know. Now, let's talk about the big fear. What if I make a mistake or don't know an answer during the oral? What if I make a mistake in the flight? There's an assumption people have that you're looking for me, the applicant, to be perfect. And that's not the case. It even says it in the ACS. Exceeding the standards is not an automatic bust. What if we're in the oral and you ask me a question and I don't know the answer. I know where the answer is, but I don't know. Can I look that up?
Absolutely. Again, most examiners will tell you if you're not sure of something, just say I don't know, or I can't remember, or my instructor never told me that, and throw your instructor under the bus. It happens all the time. Um, but I know where to find the answer, and then go look it up. And as long as the answer, and I'm exaggerating a bit here, but as long as the answer to every single question isn't um, I don't know, but I can look it up, that's perfectly okay. I would almost guarantee you that your examiner is going to ask you something that he or she may have an idea that you don't know, not to try to trick you, but to see if you know where to find the answer. A big part of the check ride is, can you find an answer that you don't know? Because you
You
will
know,
encounter those kind of things in real life.
I had a professor in college, and the best thing he ever taught, maybe the best thing I ever learned, because he gave really hard tests, but
Yeah.
they were all take home. Because he always said, education is not about memorization, it's about being able to find the information you need when you need it. And I love that. Well,
Yeah.
now the applicant is PIC on the flight, and that's in the FARs. That's not questioned. So you're essentially a passenger who's
Correct.
saying, hey, let me see this, let me see that. But if you ask me to do something that I think is dangerous or the area is not clear, there's traffic or a flock of birds, I can say, well, let me get up here a few miles and do that. That doesn't count against me, does it?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, that shows good aeronautical decision making. Yeah, the FAR 61.47 actually says that the applicant's the PIC. So, we really are passengers, just as you said, Jamie. So, for example, today, um, as far as I'm concerned, headings and altitudes, once we're done with the cross country portion, we're doing the air work and things like that. Headings and altitudes are the applicant's option. They can choose any heading, any altitude they want to choose. It's their choice. But I had given an applicant a heading of 090 to get back towards the airport, so we weren't 40 miles away when we got done with everything. And I said, okay, we need our steep turns now. And he said, well, something, there's a reference over here that I'd like to use for my starting and ending point. I don't care. Go for it. So no, that's and the same thing. Later in the flight, there was some traffic that AD was painting on ADSB, and it was far enough. It was miles and miles away. But to the applicant's credit, he was uncomfortable with how close the traffic was, and said, something, I think I want to turn here and go this way to get away from that traffic. Thumbs up. Once again, good aeronautical decision making. And it'll be a debrief item on the positive side of, I really like the fact that you didn't do what we were going to do, where we were going to do it, because you weren't comfortable with the traffic there.
Let's talk about some potential showstoppers. You mentioned the young man who had gotten bit discombobulated. There are things that if you don't have it with you, physically with you, and that includes logbook endorsements, if
Yeah.
they're not in the logbook and properly stated, that's a problem. Do you want to go through some of those? Because that is one of those things you should be sitting down with your CFI before you go to the check ride and make sure it's all there and you can find it.
Yeah. Um, to go back just to a minute, for a minute, to the companion guide that we talked about. Section 7 has the checklist of all of the things that an applicant needs to bring to the check ride. Everything. But for example, your pilot certificate. It
Mhm.
has to be the original green pilot certificate. It can't be a picture on your phone or a photocopy, even if it's a color photocopy. It must be the original. Same thing with your photo ID, your government issued photo ID. It can't be a photograph, a picture on your phone of your driver's license or a photocopy. It's got to be the original. And your medical is another issue too. It's got to be the original. It can't be, oh, I took a photocopy of it and kept keeping the safe one at, the other one at home in my safe for safekeeping. No, it has to be the original, and it has to be signed by you and the doctor. I had a guy come to me some months ago for a check ride, don't remember which one, and he pulls out this beautifully laminated medical certificate, obviously the original one. The doctor had signed it, but he hadn't. The applicant had not. And I said, I can't, not my rules, but I can't keep this. He said, well, let me get a Sharpie and I'll sign it. No, 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 no. It's got to be signed in the original on the paper. Then you can laminate it to do anything you want. Anyway, so long story made short, he was able to, believe it or not, get in touch with the FAA, who emailed him a brand new certificate signed by someone at the FAA, backdated to the date of the actual certificate. We were able to go ahead and do the check ride. But I don't know how he did it, but he was able to get that done. But you can't count on that happening. So all of that stuff has got to be the original, and the names have got to match. There's some there's some exceptions to that statement, but don't test those exceptions. The names have got to match. The spellings have got to match. These things are absolutely stop you in your tracks. It won't go any further if it doesn't happen. DPEs do not have the authority to change your name on your pilot certificate or in IACRA. Only the FSDO can do that. And good luck getting an appointment with some of those FSDOs are backed up for weeks, if not months, for in-person appointments. So this is so important. And flight instructors, any flight instructors watching this should be particularly mindful when they're helping a potential student set up their IACRA account and apply for their student pilot certificate. This stuff is deadly serious.
Well, let's talk about now we get to the oral. We get through all that precursor stuff and we get to the oral. You're going to ask me scenario based questions. It's not going to be regurgitation of memorized stuff. You're going to ask me things that make me think. Isn't that the way they do it now?
Well, yeah, but let me go back just a couple of seconds to some showstoppers here, Jamie, because
Sure.
you alluded to endorsements. For your private pilot check ride, there are at least, let me count them real quick: one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, nine, at least nine that I'm going to be looking at specifically: the TSA citizenship, the pre-solo knowledge test, the pre-solo flight training, the 90-day solo, if necessary, the additional 90-day solo, the aeronautical knowledge test, deficiencies in the knowledge test, the 3 hours of training preceding the date of the check ride, 2 calendar months prior to the check ride, and the ready for the aeronautical test, the one that quotes 61, 107, and 109. And I can't tell you the number of times that flight instructors will forget to make sure that the applicant has an updated solo endorsement. Without that solo endorsement, I can't get in the airplane because they're the pilot in command. And without that solo endorsement, they can't be the pilot in command.
That's why it is so, so important. I know CFIs are busy. We've both done that job,
Oh, yeah.
but you have to find time to sit down with your student and go through all this and make sure they're set because it is going to lower their anxiety level when they walk into the door to see you, mean and vicious as you are. that I've already been through this with my CFI. I know I have all my documents. I know I have all my endorsements. I know where everything is. I can prove the airplane's airworthy. I'm ready to go. That's a whole different thing than I'm going to fly with a guy I've never met. I'm
Yeah.
kind of nervous about this. And oh, do I have that extra solo endorsement? I don't remember if I had that or not. That can set you off on a path that means you need that discontinuance because I'm
Yeah.
just too rattled to continue.
And 61-65 Juliet is the current Bible of endorsements. And by the way, it's not just endorsements. There's a bunch of really good information in there. But we've been talking about Mosaic a lot recently, and October 22nd of 2025 is when that goes into effect. Well, because of some of the expanded privileges that sport pilots are going to be afforded, there are new endorsements for that. And so 61-65J will be superseded by 65K kilo sometime prior to Mosaic taking effect in October 22nd. So any CFIs or really anybody watching this video, if you want to have the latest and greatest information on your check ride, and it's going to happen sometime after October 22nd, make sure that you're referencing 61-65 kilo, which is in draft form right now.
Now, when we get into that oral, we get past all this and we get into that oral, you're going to ask me some specific questions and you're going to ask me about weather and weight and balance and how do I deal with inoperative equipment and what are my qualifications.
Yeah.
But we're not going to spend 45 minutes on each of those things.
No.
You're going to ask me scenario-based questions that cause me to think and justify what we're doing. Give me a little give me a thumbnail sketch of how much time are we spending on those, and is it one question and move on, or is it a couple questions and I miss one and we dig a little deeper?
Yeah. The ACS says that we have to cover at least um, one element in the knowledge section, one element in the risk section, and all of the skill elements. One of the knowledge, one risk, and one skill, all the skills. So I vary what I ask with every oral so that it doesn't become terribly predictable. But I'm not trying to trick anybody. I would just like to not be too terribly predictable about things. Um, and if I ask somebody about if I ask somebody a question, a scenario-based question, where I'm looking for them to tell me that it's my pilot certificate, my medical, and my photo ID. That's the answer I'm looking for, but that's not the question that I'm asking. All right, that's pretty good. We'll go to something else. But if I give them a scenario where that's the question, that's the answer I'm looking for, and they're struggling with that, then I might ask them another knowledge question out of that particular bank of subject matter on that particular area of operation. Um, Same thing on weight and balance. I might ask, well, for example, and this is not a scenario that I use, but it could be one day down the road. Um, you and I, Jamie, live here in Houston, and we're going to go to a sporting event in, I don't know, in Dallas. And so we're going to jump in my 182. And by the way, we're going to stop somewhere in Ennis or someplace like that. And we're going to pick up a mutual friend of ours and off we go. Um, well, I may ask you, how, especially Jamie, you're the one that's flying, you're PIC. Well, how's that going to affect your flight planning? And now
Oh,
you've got to
okay.
stop and think a little bit about, well, gosh, we've got an extra passenger now, and gosh, that's going to be a weight and balance issue, and all of a sudden you have to stop and think a little bit. It's not just I got to do this, 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 and that, but it's like, okay, well, what are the ramifications for this change? Um, and so the questions will all be kind of built around a scenario similar to that. And if you're on top of your game, as I know you always are, and you were to say, well, this is this and that and this is that, and here's what's going to happen. Oh gosh, there's a bit of an AFCG here. Oh, that could have this effect or that effect or what have you. that's probably about all I'm going to ask you. But if you start really, bobbling, on the answers and not real clear, and you're demonstrating really that you don't understand the issues at hand, then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper in the aeronautical, aerodynamics end of things. So the bottom line is that um, that's why it's so important to be so well prepared. This guy today that I mentioned, we were done with the oral in about an hour and a half. I was running out of questions and scenarios to throw at him because everything, literally everything, the one thing that he missed, the one question that he just flat out missed, he was reading a METAR for me, and I asked him if the winds were true or magnetic. And he said they're magnetic. No, they're true on a METAR because if you read it, it's true. This is
Mhm.
the one question that he just flatly got wrong. A couple of things he wasn't quite sure about, but he went to it like that, found the answers. We were done in an hour and a half. By the same token, the guy from last week, there was probably half a dozen questions that he just didn't know, period, or he wasn't sure about, and it took him. I mean, it was like the second coming of Christ. It took him forever to find. As a result, the oral went about 2.5 hours, as I remember, and we were both exhausted by the time it was over. It ended up being a discontinuance because by that time the weather had come in. It was raining, so we couldn't fly. But he was saved by the bell there.
Now we get through the oral and things have gone well. We're going to go to the flight portion now.
Yeah.
I'm going to go do a walk around, do a pre flight, because while I flew the airplane in and I'm confident it's been sitting out there for 2 hours and I haven't been watching it. So I am going to go do that pre flight. We get in. There's things I have to do there too. There are expectations before I even start up the engine where I've got to do things like the passenger brief
Right.
and, just go through that pre flight activity that I'm going to do with any passenger because you may be a DPE, but I'm pretending you're just somebody I'm flying with. Is there anything I can do as an applicant to make that a little more solid for me? Or is it just stick with the checklist, do everything that you're supposed to do? Can I do a flow or do I have to have the checklist?
Flows are okay. I don't have a problem if somebody is doing a flow as far as a checklist goes, but I do expect them to pick up the checklist when they're done and verify, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this. Oops, I forgot that. Let me go back and catch that, to verify that they did everything. You know, as you mentioned earlier, Jamie, there's some level of nerves and stress. When you've got somebody that has like FAA written across their hat, figuratively speaking,
Yep.
there's some nerves and some stress there. It's easy to forget that kind of stuff. So to go back and say, yeah, I did this, oops, forgot that. Nothing wrong at all with that.
One of the real misunderstandings I've often found with applicants who have not been well prepped by their CFI, they assume the oral is over because we're going to the flight, but the oral's never really over, is it?
No, the oral's never really over. We can ask really questions about anything at any time, from start to finish, even when the airplane is tied down and walking back to the to the FBO. Um, I've had occasions where we've been walking back and the applicant has made a comment about something that just what you know and fortunately they never resulted in a bust. But it's sometimes you just keeping your mouth closed is really a good option sometimes.
Well, and we mentioned earlier that you don't have to be perfect. There, it is in the ACS that you know, the going beyond the limits is not a bust in and of itself.
Well, not necessarily,
I
but
was
that's
going to say there are certain things. For instance, if we go flying and you ask me to do a power on stall, and I clear the area and do a power on stall, and you ask me to do a power off stall, and I clear the area and do a power off stall, and you ask me to do a steep turn, and I go right into it, that's a problem. Not doing a clearing turn is an issue, isn't it?
yeah. The ACS does require clearing turns in advance of most of the maneuvers. Oftentimes, we can incorporate clearing turns in some of the maneuvers that are being done. For example, if we're in slow flight and I give an applicant a 90-degree turn to the right and a 90-degree turn back to the left, and before we go into power off stall, for example, that is adequate for a clearing turn, and we'll discuss that. But I do expect them to understand and perform clearing turns where they're required. And if they consistently forget to do that, you know, the ACS never says that you can never exceed a standard. The ACS never says that. What it says is you can't consistently exceed the standards. And if you
Mhm.
find yourself exceeding the standards, a basis for failure is not taking corrective action immediately. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically that's what it says in the
Mhm.
ACS. So, what does that mean in practicality? Um, Maybe you're doing a steep turn and you gain 120 feet halfway around, but you recognize it and fix it and you end up within the standards. Okay, probably going to be a debrief item. Um, Maybe on slow flight, I tell you to turn left heading 180 and you overshoot and you go to 200 degrees or something like that. Um, Probably going to be a debrief item. But if every maneuver or most maneuvers are right on the edge or beyond the 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 uh, uh, the standards, then that's going to really be a problem. Um, you have your spot plus 200 feet on a short field landing. Um, you know, most of the 1,000-foot markers at a standard 1,000-foot marker is 150 feet long. Well, all right, but what's 50 feet beyond that? I don't have a tape measure.
Mhm.
Um, if they look like they're reasonably within 200 feet, okay. The error the benefit of the doubt will go to the applicant as far as I'm concerned if everything has gone reasonably well in the check ride. But if we're 4 centerline stripes beyond the 1,000-foot marker, and again, I'm exaggerating a little bit for the effect, but if we're 4 centerline stripes beyond the 1,000-foot markers, which then in and of themselves are 150 feet long, and each runway stripe on a standard airport is 120 feet, um, they've obviously overshot the 200 feet that they've got, and so that's going to be a problem.
It is one of those things I always find entertaining because I have talked to people who have busted a ride for various reasons, and they're generally trying to rationalize why they didn't really bust. The examiner had it out for them. But I love that you point out that you actually know the distance of these markings, so you're keeping track mentally. It's not a random thing. Well, let me ask you this. I know I'm going to do an emergency procedure on this ride. The likelihood is very high. And so at some point, you're probably going to give me an engine failure. Are you going to maneuver me out over the Okefenokee swamp so I've got no place to go for 30 miles? Or are you going to have a heart and do that in a place where I've got maybe a grass strip or a large farmer's field and maybe even a paved airport right below me and see what I pick? Which option does the average DPE go for?
Well, I don't know what the average one goes for. I can tell you that while I generally don't plan to be over an airport when that happens because I do too many rides at too many different airports where there isn't an airport close by. It did actually happen today where there was a very nice grass strip right below us with 3 runways to choose from, and the applicant said, "Well, I'm going to land. There's a really good strip or a really good grass field way out there." And I just said, "Well, what about the airport right underneath us?" And he looked, "Oh." So, and he made a nice approach, and we didn't land obviously. And here's one of the issues with that. Most of the flight school, in fact, all of the flight schools that I do check rides for, prohibit their students from landing on grass. So
Mhm.
even if I wanted to take them all the way down, the flight schools themselves say no. And of course, that's another discussion entirely about how we train for emergency procedures, which is wholly inadequate. But that's another discussion at some time for another time.
That whole emergency thing is a favorite of mine because I started years ago. I would get students under the hood and vector them around and climbing and descending. And I'd get them to about 5,500 feet directly over our home airport,
Yeah.
tell them to take the foggles off and take me home. And everywhere they look looks familiar,
Yeah.
but they can't figure out where they are. And
Yeah.
it was really my way of saying, look straight down,
Yeah.
look what's below us. Don't just look out. There's a whole world out there. But
So,
anyhow,
yeah.
Pat, I
So,
think I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think you were probably getting ready to kind of wrap things up, but let me just, this is a shameless plug for my website, HoustonDPE.com. But we didn't really get into a lot of the common errors and things like that, because that is a show in and of itself. But if people are interested in seeing anything on common errors, if you go to my website and scroll down a little bit, you're going to find a sheet of a document on common errors for private and commercial, and a document on common errors for instrument. And you'll also find, I think there are 4 podcasts that I did with a local flight school and another local examiner, under the heading of Behind the Prop. And there's links to 4 podcasts there that talk about common errors from 2 different DPE standpoints, on private, commercial, and instrument. And it is well worth taking the time to listen to those things if you're an examiner, excuse me, if you're a flight instructor prepping somebody for a check ride, especially if you're somebody who's prepping for a private, commercial, or instrument check ride. So HoustonDPE.com, and you'll find all kinds of information on common errors and such.
I can't thank you enough, Pat. And I mean it in all sincerity. This is one of those things that if somebody would just sit through this video and listen to these, there's an awful lot of solid information in here that will make the likelihood of you passing your check ride much higher. And of course, passing your check ride on the first try saves money and it lowers stress.